So, what to expect next? That is the $20 million question. My colleague and the chair of the WCI Film Festival Lecture Series, Dr. Rae Muhlstock, is going to come up here and talk to us about, can I say it?
You can say it.
Vampire sex. Now, church is on Sunday for some folks, so you've got enough time to kind of get it out of your system, but I would say there's a long history of vampires and sex, but I guess we'll find out. So Rae is a distinguished scholar. She has presented her work at various conferences throughout the United States and Europe. She has been invited to give keynote addresses. She hails from the shores of Teaneck, New Jersey. So if you want to buy her a coffee, that would be great. Tough room. Okay, so I don't know, we'll sing some Springsteen? Okay, so without further ado, let's just let Rae do all the talking. So please welcome my colleague, Dr. Rae Muhlstock, on vampire sex.
So yeah, the next Karate Kid will be mask on, mask off. No, I was trying to follow up. I'm better off than original material. All right, well, hello everybody, and thank you for that wonderful introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. And let me see if I can figure out tech. I can. It's amazing. So I want to start by asking who here has been attracted to a vampire from a book, a movie, a TV show? You can be honest. I know 3 p.m., Dave and Salvatore, every single one of you, hands up. No? Okay, there, I see a couple of them. Yeah, it's a long tradition of people attracted to vampires. According to folklorist Michael Molina, the vampire is almost as old as humanity itself. Stories about revenants returned from the dead to feed off the living date back to pre-history. But they were not the vampires as we know them today. For instance, images dating back to the 7th to 9th century BCE depict the Mesopotamian Lamashtu as a female demon with the head of a lion, the teeth and ears of a donkey, a hairy body, blood-stained hands, long fingers and nails, and the clawed, talon-like feet of a bird. Sometimes a piglet and a whelp would dangle from her bare breasts. She feeds on the blood of pregnant women teeming with life and was said to be the cause of miscarriages and stillbirths. The Malaysian Penanggal is a nocturnal vampire entity often associated with the practice of dark magic. As the story goes, in return for keeping a vegetarian diet for 40 days, a woman is granted exceptional beauty. But if she breaks the restricted diet before that time is up, she is cursed to spend her nights as a floating head with dangling entrails and an unquenchable thirst for the blood of pregnant women and newborns. It's said that from afar she twinkles like a ball of flame and is perhaps one explanation for the will-o'-the-wisp phenomenon, as well as the Stephanie Meyer phenomenon. No? Okay, couple. All right. And then, of course, is the Romanian strigoi. Lethargic by day, they attack their victims during the night with long protruding tongues, not entirely unlike the innermost mouth of Ridley Scott's Alien, leaving marks on the corpses of their victims. They are troubled spirits that are said to have risen from the grave with the abilities to transform into animals and become invisible. There are 2 types, strigoi mort, who are transformed after death, and strigoi V, living vampires, humans who are infected with vampirism while still alive. So what does all of this have to do with a bare-chested 90-year-old vampire trapped forever in the sparkling body of a 17-year-old Adonis? These images of the Lamashtu, Penanggal, and strigoi, which are just 3 of the numerous folklore entities that exist in some state of undeath and feed off the blood of the living, show us what the vampire predecessors looked like before they sparkled in the sun. These vampires still circulate in pop culture. For instance, the strigoi appear in TV's The Strain, created by Guillermo del Toro and Chuck Hogan, which ran on FX from 2014 to 17. And in Faye Jackson's 2009 film Strigoi. And I forgot another shameless plug because we are showing Guillermo del Toro's first feature-length film, Kronos, on Saturday. So if you're obsessed with vampires, and I know that some of you are because I see you twice a week and we talk about them, you might have noticed a bifurcation of the image of the contemporary vampire in fiction and on screen. On the one hand, in some science and speculative fiction, some in horror TV shows, film, comic books, and video games, like The Strain and Strigoi, we continue to see images of the monstrous vampire who harken back to a folkloric past, horrific killing machines so unlike humans in their appearance and behavior. On the other hand, scholars Amanda Hobson and Melissa Onweyu note that there also exists a, quote, romanticized version of the vampire, a suave, debonair aristocrat that can be found frequently moralizing about their existence. These vampires are represented in romance and urban fantasy films and literature such as the Twilight Saga, the Vampire Diaries, and innumerable paranormal romance novels, including the Gilda Stories by Jewel Gomez, who will be visiting campus tomorrow at 6 p.m. via Zoom as the keynote guest for the Vampire Film Festival and Lecture Series. There are even some examples that blend the two ideas of the vampire. Think of the many vampires in TV's Buffy the Vampire Slayer or the Blade and Underworld film series. Each of these offers a range of vampiric archetypes, from the purely monstrous to the redemptively human, to all of those beautiful threats in between. In these narratives, the monstrous foil to the vampire love interest of the commonly female heroine highlights how desirable a bit of danger is in our vampire narratives. So the second human, sexy image of the vampire emerges in the 18th century Eastern Europe, when vampire superstition seems to have been on the rise. Unknown diseases and plagues spread rampantly through towns and villages, causing numerous deaths very quickly. In this pre-scientific era, folklore often provided narratives of explanation. When grave diggers, grave robbers, and investigators dug up bodies, what they found looked like evidence for a new kind of vampire. The bodies seemed to have grown hair and nails after official expiration. Teeth, especially canines, protruded from dehydrated gums. Bellies seemed bloated as if just having attended a feast, and blood would drip from the corners of their mouths. While modern science can easily explain these phenomena as natural to a decaying body, we can understand how 18th century investigators could easily mistake this as signs for vampiric undeath. It was declared that bodies found in such a state must be staked to the coffin or decapitated to ensure a true death. And as they do, these stories spread, and soon there was such a flurry of grave digging, staking, and beheading that the Queen of Austria declared it illegal to disturb the grave. Like, that's pretty big. But these legends survive in local superstitions, passed down as myths and folktales, and inspired a fair few works of literature in the 19th century, solidifying what we now recognize as the vampire. Dun, dun, dun. Sexy, seductive, and all the more deadly because of it. So the humanizing of the vampire that emerged along with these works of literature came with some nifty side effects. The ability to pass for human created fantastic narrative tension in the Gothic tradition. The characteristic seduction and the intimacy of the bite fueled innuendo and terror. And, proving very useful to certain dominant parties, the element of social control was reintroduced through sexual desire. According to folklorist Theodore Barada, Strigoi morts, those that become Strigoi after death, are transformed due to certain behaviors perpetuated while they were living, including leading a life of sin, dying without being married, taking notes on that one? Dying by execution for perjury, dying by suicide, and dying from a witch's curse. We can see that certain aspects of the folklore have their roots in social control, policing bodies and coercing socially desired behaviors. This increased significantly when the vampire could be anyone you pass on the street or who might creep in through your window under the cover of night. This may be part and parcel to what it means to be a monster. According to the foundational monster theorist Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, quote, "The monster of prohibition exists to demarcate the bonds that hold together the systems of relations that we call culture, to call horrid attention to the borders that cannot, must not be crossed. The monster pressures these borders of what is considered acceptably human within dominant society. Confronting it places us firmly at the boundary between the cultivated and the wild, the familiar and the unknown, the human and the monstrous. But far more dangerously, as Cohen suggests, the monster can awaken us to pleasures we might deny or deny ourselves as human members of respective cultures. The vampire's place in literature and pop culture is indeed steeped in suppressed desire. The desire of the vampires themselves, the desire for the vampires, the desire to be free of the trappings that come with membership to a species constrained by the human body, our own mortality, age, and time. In this way, Cohen theorizes, the monster has an uncanny ability to simultaneously attract and repulse its victims. According to Cohen, quote, "We distrust and loathe the monster, while at the same time we envy its freedom." These freedoms that monsters possess, which Cohen calls horizons of liberation, are intrinsically linked to the forbidden, making the monster, in this case the vampire, quote, "all the more appealing as a temporary egress from constraint." The idea that vampires are synonymous with sexual desire, often deviant, is central to the first vampire fictions to emerge from 19th century Europe, and the trope has stayed with us to this day. The first of these works, John Polidori's The Vampire, published in 1819, is considered the first modern vampire story. It's a tragic tale of a young man coerced by a rakish vampire to keep his deadly secret just long enough for him to seduce, marry, and subsequently murder the young man's sister. This seduction of both siblings, the vampire's charms leading to both of their deaths, signals the danger of stepping beyond the accepted social conventions surrounding desire and sexuality. Both the female love interest and her male protector fail to return from the borders that they cross. By the time she's found dead and drained of her blood, the vampire is long gone, having adopted a pseudonym in search of his next victim. Polidori's seductive vampire, however, has nothing on Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla. Upping the ante on what might be considered deviant desire at the time, this vampire seductress fills our fantasies as she embodies contradicting ideas of femininity, such as fragility, strength, beauty, and power. The novel, published in 1872, is the story of fair Laura, seduced to the brink by her beautiful, mysterious houseguest, Carmilla. Frail when she arrives at their door, Carmilla grows in strength as she and Laura grow closer. Laura, of course, slowly grows weaker, paler, and closer to death. According to Amanda Hobson, quote, "The female vampire illustrates historically specific and continuing cultural fears about women's sexuality, as well as the titillation of the sexually voracious, beautiful, but deadly spectress." Film and television adaptations, as well as the audio play that we'll hear a bit from in a second, emphasize Carmella's desire for Laura and Laura's own sexual awakening, stimulated by a dream she had when she was 6 years old, and was first bedded by a vampire. The dream, of course, is not a dream, and Carmilla imprints on Laura at this young age, stoking a fire in her that smolders softly, hidden away until Carmilla reappears years later to rekindle its flame. So I realize the acoustics are a little, might not have been great with that, but we can at least hear how breathy, how sensuous that dialogue was. The threat of the female vampire arises from the fear of women's sexuality, especially of women who embrace and express their sexual hungers, or who act as agents for their own desire. But a greater threat than the female vampire's unbridled sexuality, as Le Fanu crafts it, is the potential as contagion. At the time that Le Fanu and his contemporaries were writing their Gothic vampire romances, Hobson observes, quote, "Beliefs about womanhood center on the notion of idealized feminine weakness and passivity, and one specific type of weakness, the purported moral weakness manifested through the voracious and destructive nature of female sexuality. The female vampire, with her heightened physical strength and her longevity, move her firmly into the utterly uncontrollable category. She therefore embodies all of the cultural fears of women's sexuality, especially that it is unquenchable and uncontained by male-dominated institutions, such as the church, the family, and even the government. The lovely Laura only barely escapes alive because the men in her life, her father, her uncle, who lost his own daughter to that same Carmilla, although she was going by a different name then, and a mysterious baron, a deus ex machina, who appears just in time and with just the right expertise. These men are able to restore gender and social norms by defeating Carmilla, indeed penetrating her with a phallic wooden stake. But desire once kindled is difficult to extinguish. At the end of the account, Laura admits to her doctor that, quote, "To this hour, the image of Carmilla returns to memory with ambiguous alternations. Sometimes the playful, languid, beautiful girl, sometimes the writhing fiend I saw in the ruined church. And often from a reverie I have started, fancying I heard the light step of Carmilla at the drawing room door." Ultimately, it is not Carmilla, but Laura who possesses the greater threat to male-dominated, heteronormative social conventions of the era. Even to this day, we see the threat of female latent sexuality awakened by the vampire as a great threat to the feminine ideals held by dominant culture. Take, for instance, the cynical, strong, loyal Tara Mae Thornton, played by Regina Wellesley in HBO's True Blood. According to the show's creator, Alan Ball, Tara is the smartest person in Bon Ton, yet even she is susceptible to their vampire problem. She is turned around the middle of the series and must adjust to her new life as a vampire. So what do we see in these two images? How does vampire Tara, which is the one on the left, differ from human Tara, the one on the right? What do these visual cues maybe indicate about the destructive power of female sexuality as manifested through vampirism? Any ideas? Yeah. The human one is the one with the
Vampires on our right.
This is a vampire.
Yeah, our right.
Yeah, that's a human. I don't know my right and left. You all know this. At least I haven't tripped over a trash can yet today. So what do you think? What's the difference between the two? Hmm? Good. Yeah, the vampire shows more sexual empowerment. I got the gist, right? What else? Hmm?
The vampire is more intimidating.
More intimidating? Yeah. But what makes her more intimidating? Her eyes, the sort of open top, so she's showing a lot more skin. Volume in the hair, curly hair, indicates wild women, or so I'm told. When I stopped straightening my hair. Good, anything else?
The kind of shoulders back, chest up indicates a lot more confidence.
Good. Shoulders back, chest out, this sort of more confident posture. Her blocking is different. So it's not just the way she looks, it's the confidence that she's exuding. And we do see it certainly through the wardrobe, but we see it through her posture as well. Nice. Good. So traveling back in time. 25 years after the publication of Carmilla, Bram Stoker published his vampire novel, Dracula. These latent fears and desires broached in his literary predecessor were still unresolved and were still attached to the image of the vampire. In Dracula, we see vampiric sexual deviance and desire on many fronts. Dracula himself, a minority within white male patriarchy, in films often quoted as Jewish, threatens the British mores with his strange diet and sleeping habits, his harem of brides, his contamination of Renfield, Lucy Westenra, and Nina Harker. Christina de Rocher notes that, quote, Stoker's Count Dracula is the epitome of the monstrous transgressor, who, as a representative other, expresses cultural anxieties. He is the foreigner that embodies Victorian England xenophobia, the hyper-masculine male who sexually desires white women, and his eternal life allows him the ability to amass great wealth, making him a capitalist with no lifespan to curtail its accumulation. Thus, de Rocher concludes, quote, the slaying of Dracula becomes not just about killing a monster, but about restoring the social order by reestablishing white male supremacy and the secure sexual access to the white women that it ensured. Mina Murray has just married Jonathan Harker when she falls under the sway of the immigrant Count Dracula. Having found her fiancé weakened and hysterical in a sanitarium, Mina must embody the masculine ideal. She is praised in the novel for having a mind like a man's, capable of critical and analytic thinking, and such hypermasculine skills as shorthand. Really hard, apparently. She weds her Jonathan while he still lays frail in his hospital bed, lending him her strength, protecting him from his own nightmares and his memories of the transgressive castle Dracula. Jonathan grows stronger under her care, and Mina's gender transgressions are put firmly back in their place. Yet despite all of this, Stoker's Mina displays the same sexual susceptibility of Laura. She is easily seduced by Dracula. While staying in his castle in Transylvania, a solicitor turned hostage of the vampiric desires of his host. Jonathan Harker discovers just how deep the sexual thread of Dracula runs. I mentioned his harem of brides earlier. Dracula has 3 vampire brides who stay with him in his castle. Jonathan comes upon these women, or well, rather they come upon him, and unleashing not just their own deviant desire, but Jonathan's as well. So I'll read to you from the novel. This is, for those of you who have not read Dracula, it's an epistolary novel. This is a section from Jonathan's journals from his visit to Transylvania. In the moonlight opposite me were 3 young women, ladies by their dress and manner. I thought at the time that I must be dreaming when I saw them, for though the moonlight was behind them, they threw no shadow on the floor. They came close to me and looked at me for some time, and then whispered together. 2 were dark and had high aquiline noses like the Count's, and great, dark, piercing eyes that seemed to be almost red when contrasted with the pale yellow moon. The other was fair as can be, with great wavy masses of golden hair and eyes like pale sapphires. I seemed somehow to know her face, and to know it in connection with some dreamy fear, but I could not recollect at the moment how or where. All 3 had brilliant white teeth that shone like pearls against the ruby of their voluptuous lips. There was something about them that made me uneasy, some longing and at the same time some deadly fear. I felt in my heart a wicked, burning desire that they would kiss me with those red lips. It is not good to note this down, lest someday it should meet Mina's eyes and cause her pain, but it is the truth. They whispered together, and then they all 3 laughed, such a silvery, musical laugh, but as hard as though the sound never could have come through the softness of human lips. It was like the intolerable, tingling sweetness of water glasses when played on by a cunning hand. The fair girl shook her head coquettishly, and the other 2 urged her on. One said, "Go on, you are the first, and we shall follow. Yours is the right to begin." And the other said, "He is young and strong. There are kisses for us all." I lay quiet, looking out under my eyelashes in agony of delightful anticipation. The fair girl advanced and bent over me till I could feel the movement of her breath upon me. Sweet it was in one sense, honey sweet, and sent the same tingling through the nerves as her voice, but with a bitter underlying sweet, a bitter offensiveness as one smells in blood. I was afraid to raise my eyelids, but looked out and saw perfectly under the lashes. The girl went on her knees and bent over me, simply gloating. There was a deliberate voluptuousness which was both thrilling and repulsive, and as she arched her neck, she actually licked her lips like an animal, till I could see in the moonlight the moisture shining on the scarlet lips and on the red tongue as it lapped the white, sharp teeth. Lower and lower went her head as her lips went down below the range of my mouth and chin and seemed about to fasten on my throat. Then she paused, and I could hear the churning sound of her tongue as it licked her teeth and lips, and I could feel the hot breath on my neck. Then the skin of my throat began to tingle as one's flesh does when the hand that is to tickle it approaches nearer. I could feel the soft, shivering touch of her lips on the super sensitive skin of my throat, and the hard dents of 2 sharp teeth, just touching and pausing there. I closed my eyes in a languorous ecstasy and waited with beating heart. Ooh, Bram Stoker. No? All right. So luckily, or perhaps not, Jonathan is saved from these women by Dracula himself, who claims Jonathan for his own and tosses his brides a crying newborn to feast on instead. According to Hobson, this idea of the female vampire, quote, arises from the notion of women's sexuality as inherently destructive if left unchecked and when not controlled by men. and vampiric sexuality is the ultimate in destructive forces. The female vampire, therefore, is the perfect metaphor for that unstoppable force, draining her victims of vitality, their blood, and sexual energy. These monstrous women slowly kill their prey, luring them into unproductive sexual encounters, draining them of blood and their perceived masculine essence. As with novels, there is room for interpretation. Dracula is an epistolary novel, its narrative composed of journals, casebooks, letters, and diaries by multiple narrators. While Jonathan tells us that he has been drained by his host, himself growing weaker as the Count grows younger, stronger, more virile, and much, much more dangerous, the extent of Dracula's claim on Jonathan is unclear. The 2020 Netflix miniseries created by Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat unravels this thread, imagining Jonathan's sexual desire unleashed by his encounters with the vampires of the castle as deviant not just because of its adulterous nature, but because it is set in firm opposition to the social and sexual mores of Victorian England. In this clip, we meet up with Jonathan in a sanitarium. Jonathan, played by John Heffernan, is questioned by Sister Agatha Van Helsing, played by Dolly Weiss. When it comes to the sex appeal of vampires, Anne Rice may always reign as the queen of the damned. In Interview with the Vampire, based on the book by the same name, the rakish Louis, who, having lost his lust for mortal life, courts death, is met and seduced by the vampire Lestat. In an intimate embrace through which Lestat, played by Tom Cruise, turns Louis, played by Brad Pitt, we can see the sensual euphoria on Louis' face as his body rises in time with Lestat's. Soon after this first act of penetration, Lestat appears at Louis' bedside. The latter man, not yet a vampire, is frail, weakened by their encounter, but his desire for what Lestat would later call the dark gift has already been roused. Lestat awakens a thirst in Louis of which he did not know himself capable. In the act of changing into a vampire, he returns Lestat's thirst with his own, draining his sire greedily after himself being drained. Christina de Rocher notes that, quote, whereas Count Dracula has a foreign and unnatural appearance and mannerism that foreshadow his monstrous nature, Rice's attractive vampire men appear outwardly human. It is their actions that expose their ruthless natures, but it is the mask of humanity that exposes the danger of their desire and their desire for them. The deviant sexual dynamics between vampire and human, which is established in these works of literature and film, find new life in the 21st century, when, according to Michelle J. Smith and Christine Morzuri, quote, the Gothic has experienced a cultural resurgence in literature, film, and television for young adult audiences. Young adult readers poised between childhood and adulthood have proven especially receptive to the Gothic's theme of liminality, monstrosity, transgression, romance, and sexuality. The central concerns of the Gothic YA literature and teen TV remain consistent with those of canonical Gothic texts, including the growth and transformation of the child, the crisis of adolescence, and the sometimes painful transition into adulthood. The Gothic child of the 18th and 19th centuries was often characterized by ambiguity, mystery, liminality, violence, and monstrosity. Similar qualities can be found in the human heroines in narratives like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, The Vampire Diaries, and the Twilight series. They are almost always young, white teenagers on the brink of adulthood. Their interactions with their sexual awakenings and their desire for vampire lovers foreground the physical and emotional challenges of becoming an adult. These metaphors fueled TV's Buffy the Vampire Slayer. If you thought high school was hell, try attending one that is literally on hell's doorstep. The metaphor acts both literally within the diegesis of the show and figuratively for the teenage viewers who may have found, like Buffy, that losing their virginity to a man they thought they could trust results in unleashing both of their innermost monsters. Don't worry, you don't have to wait long to find out the conclusion. And I love that the computer started syncing up at Buffy the Vampire Slayer, right? And now we're gonna be friends. So what should be a moment of perfect happiness results in a terror that threatens to consume Buffy and her loved ones. Okay, I know the suspense is killing you. I won't make you wait any longer. Obviously, she's not okay. Can't you hear the music? Now, I know clearly the computer is a Spike, Team Spike. No Scoobies in the audience who actually understood that reference, sorry. So de Rocher suggests that, quote, such conduct reminds the audience that vampire men are wearing the mask of an attractive, romantic young human, a facade that hides their bestial, dominant, and powerful nature. In Julie Peck and Kelvin Williamson's Vampire Diaries, Elena Gilbert is a modern-day Mina, unable to resist the lure of her vampire love interest, even when she discovers his hidden truth. And in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the first clip. Don't worry, I did this for all of you. I have another clip. With the realization of those, Elena slowly comes to realize that this guy's been acting weird, and sometimes his face changes, and he kind of acts weird, and he doesn't really eat in front of her, and like very frustratingly slowly it dawns on her that like, maybe he's a vampire? Okay, so this realization of the world awakened by her love for the vampire is followed a few episodes later by this very Mina Harker moment. And yet, the human and sometimes inhuman women who love them still. What is this impulse? So despite meeting Damon Salvatore while he is wearing his true nature, Elena loves him unconditionally by the end of the series, having cast aside his younger brother, who is both kinder, being more human, and deadlier, being more vampire, than Damon is himself. Despite knowing that Edward is capable of incredible darkness, Bella puts her own life and that of their child in his sparkly hands. And despite the fact that their very union brought out the darkness inside Angel, Buffy never gets over her first vampire love. It echoes through the remainder of the series and its spin-off and the comic book series that follows. The great threat of the sexy, alluring, seductive vampire is not necessarily what it unleashes of itself, but what it unleashes in us, the humans who are attracted to them. The vampire is free to live by his own base desires, and engaging with these denizens of desire allows their human lovers access to their own deepest, darkest, basest, bloodiest lusts. Or at least that's how they might seem to the powerful societies that demonize them. Yet this is perhaps the bigger threat. For the modern, sexy, beautifully inhuman vampire's proximity to the sanctity of the normal is what allows for the most intimate fight, the one parents and protectors never see coming, the one that turns the lovelorn human into a vampire herself. So thank you, and Weaver. Really, that was all an excuse to get some Buffy the Vampire Slayer into you all.